it would seem so unfair to invite Sam Harris, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, to the stage. There's only 2 horsemen, I guess, now here on the stage. But Sam, of course, became very well known for his own writing and also for a number of appearances that he made along with Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And, with all of his work on religion, his book, The End of Faith, that Ryan spoke about, which is the first book that I was familiar with. And so I can't help but segue some of the conversation, the presentation that you made, into the topic of religion. Your book was dedicated to Hitch, so I'm assuming that's Christopher Hitchens,
Yes.
and I wanted to welcome you to talk about that.
Yeah, well, it was not based on any felicity of the subject matter. I don't think we'd ever spoken about free will, but it was a timing thing. It was what I was writing and finishing when he died, so it seemed like the right moment. Hitch, I'm sure all of you know his work, if not, if you haven't met him, but he was, everyone's unique, everyone's one of a kind, but he was especially so. He was just, I'd never met anyone like him, and so it was a real honor to be a collaborator of his, to have him consider me a collaborator, and he is certainly missed.
So do you want to elaborate a little bit about some of your thoughts, that how they've evolved and on religions since you wrote the book Free Will, and maybe in the context of some of the conflict that we see in the world today?
Well, it hasn't changed much since I started focusing on the problem, but I'm continually amazed at just how much a variable it is in our lives, and it's an unspoken variable. It's not, and again, I'm speaking globally, and I don't know so much about the situation in Canada per se, but in the U.S., when you read a newspaper, I was just saying this at my table, sometimes I pick up the New York Times, and literally every other story would be unthinkable but for the crazy and unjustifiable things people believe in the name of religion. And often these stories are not explicitly about religion. It's discussed as politics, it's discussed as some problem in medical research. It's discussed as ethics, but the core problem when you're talking about impeding embryonic stem cell research, or the crisis in the Middle East, or any the pedophile abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. Religion is everywhere, and it's something that it does immense unnecessary harm at its worst, and at its best, it gives people bad reasons to be good where good reasons are actually available. This is the problem. Whenever you can see someone doing really good things in the name of faith, you can find better reasons to do those things. And so when people go to Africa, there's no question that people of faith do immensely compassionate things much of the time. And so people will go to, missionaries will go to Africa and put themselves in harm's way and try to deliver aid to people on the verge of famine. And it's an intrinsically good thing to do, but rather often you see the compassion of the whole enterprise eroded by this other agenda, which is to spread the gospel in this case. And so you have people preaching the importance of believing in Jesus in areas where conflict between Christians and Muslims has literally killed millions of people. And in the most diabolical instances, withholding aid from people who have, until they have somehow confessed an allegiance to the creed you're spreading. It would be so much better to actually just care about the suffering of other human beings and want to alleviate it. And that's actually possible to do. You have secular people, you have people like the people who work with Doctors Without Borders, for instance, who for reasons that have nothing to do with the next life, try to make this life at least tolerable for the least advantaged people on earth. So the problem with religion is that even in its best instance, it gives you a version of ethical truth that could be improved by stripping out the dogmatism and the unjustified claims to knowledge.
You had mentioned when we were just talking earlier that the concept of free will is quite anathema to those who subscribe to the view in religion that people have free will. Could you elaborate on the controversy that you've caused in that area?
Well, the claim that free will is an illusion is anathema. That's precisely what you can't believe if you want to take any of these faith-based religions seriously, because when you look at the response to the phenomenon of evil. So in religion, you have what's called the problem of theodicy, or the problem of evil. And the answer to the question is, so how is it that an omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient God would allow the Nazis to round up little boys and girls and kill them? And the answer coming from religion is, well, people have free will, and God, even though he wouldn't countenance this sort of thing, free will sort of on the ground floor of our situation, and even an omnipotent and compassionate God couldn't stop the Nazis. That's not what this place is about. Now, of course, that answer to the problem of human suffering doesn't cover all of the other sources of needless human suffering which an omnipotent God would be responsible for, like tsunamis and epidemics and smallpox killing 500 million people in the 20th century. That has nothing to do with free will, and that is obviously something that God should be held to account for. But this notion of free will is the best answer that religious people have come up with for the problem of human evil after thinking about it for almost 3,000 years. The problem is that this idea of free will doesn't make any sense. And it's also the only justification for the notion of sin and the notion of that a person could be held responsible for turning away from God or not being convinced by the evidence of God or not believing in God. And we're in a very perverse situation. We've been given this faculty of reason. We've been given a desire for evidence. And perversely, we've been given an ability to write better books than the books God has supposedly written. And yet we are told we're going to be damned for eternity if we don't believe every single jot and tittle of the text. And that's just... Free will is the thread upon which all of those claims are strung morally. I mean, retributive justice, divine retributive justice, makes absolutely no sense. It's just pure sadism if you strip out this idea of free will.
It's fascinating. I'm going to take the microphone over here. Mark has a question, and it's not very often that you can say, well, I don't know, are you like a brain surgeon? And, I can actually say that about Mark, and he's going to ask you some questions about brains and neuroscience.
I wanted to actually just say that I'm an amateur neuroscientist, but my day job is brain surgery.
So you actually cut brains, yes.
But I'd like to thank you, Dr. Harris, actually for a fascinating, tantalizing discussion that you brought forth with the preamble to the dinner. I was dragged here by my oldest son, who's actually a fan of yours, as well as a fan of Hitchens and Dawkins, and that's I wasn't looking forward to tonight at all, but since your talk, it provoked actually 2 questions and a comment. So try to follow my train of thought. My first question is, if thought doesn't originate in the brain of the thinker, where does it come from? My second, or my comment is while I was listening to your talk, I thought I should ask a question. And my second question is, and I don't know where that thought came from.
Right. Yeah.
My second question is, and this is actually is important to me because I do take out tumors of the amygdala. Does the tumor cause the abnormal behavior, or does the abnormal behavior cause the tumor? Those are my questions.
Right.
Good question.
Well, the first question is that clearly thoughts do originate in the brain, or at least there's every reason to believe that they originate in the brain. Now, it depends on just how far you want to trace back the chain of causes, because obviously you can trace it all the way back through the history of your brain and your conception, and you can go on back to the Big Bang if you want to keep looking for just the sheer chain of causality. But it's not unreasonable to draw a circle around the proximate causes of any thought or behavior and say, well, yeah, it's this state of your brain in this instant that is producing that thought, and kind of sort of start the clock running right there. The problem is, from a objective point of view, all of that is happening based on prior events which you didn't create and which are exact. So your brain, the microstructure of your brain, it's both anatomical and functional state. You know, the charges at every synapse are exactly as they are in this instant and no different. And that constrains what you do and think in the next instant completely. And if you think there's something else that is part of the formula, that something else is also just as mysterious and just as deterministic. Even if that something else is piped in from another dimension as a Christian soul, it's still, from the point of view of your conscious experience, is not something you are responsible for. So if you have a soul that gets in there and rolls the dice with every third decision and biases you one direction or another, that's not free will. That's just more clockwork that you are not aware of in this instant. So and of course, there's no good reason to think that that's in fact what's happening. There's every reason to think that a much more deterministic picture of human thought and behavior is in fact true, and then there's some random events that are probably relevant. But the idea of behavior, I know absolutely nothing about how behavior could create a tumor in the amygdala. Behavior could certainly change the amygdala or change any region of the brain connected to it. I mean, we know that plasticity is a reality, but in terms of a tumor growing, I don't know. But the tumor is just a surrogate for just talking about. A tumor is just an example of a physical structure or event that we look at as adventitious. It's a visitor to the life of this particular brain. This brain didn't start out with a tumor. This person didn't want a tumor. The owner of the brain didn't know he had a tumor. And then when we look, the tumor's in the right place, and it seems to suggest, well, this tumor is actually changing what this person thinks and feels and does. So this guy was hijacked by something that's obviously not supposed to be there in some sense. But the tumor is just a very easy case of looking at a proximate physical cause that we all agree is anomalous, and then all notions of free will or this is an evil person just go out the window. But what I'm saying is that every physical cause has the same character. Having the genes you have is just like, being as precisely as intelligent as you are, based on your genes and your life experience, is one big tumor of a sort. I mean, it is a given fact, which is changing over time. So it's not to say that your education didn't play a role and your relationships. All of that changes your brain, and it changes over time, and it gives you new capacities, and you learn new languages, or whatever happens matters. But that whole process is just an unfolding of one event following another, and there's no place you can stand, proudly saying, "I did it. I'm a self-made man." And and when you see someone else malfunctioning, you see a psychopath, or you see someone who's clearly living in some non-normative way, you can't really say, well, he is the cause. He, the person in this instant, he is the ultimate author. And that I think, it's scientifically true to say that, but it's also morally relevant to say that, because it's clear that it would be relevant if we had a treatment. So the other thing that's interesting about a tumor is that a tumor suggests to non-surgeons and if it's the right tumor, obviously certainly to surgeons, that there's an easy fix. You just cut the tumor out and the person's back to who he was, or at least is likely to be to some degree. That if we understood the brain completely, if we had a truly mature science of the mind, and we were lucky enough to have the technology to be able to intervene in ways that we wanted, well, then it would all be like, it would be as simple, it would be more complicated in fact, but in principle it would be as simple as just cutting out the tumor. So if we understood psychopathy perfectly, and it was such a thing at the level of the brain that it could be intervened upon without side effects, then psychopathy would be a disease that we would have a cure for, and it could be so straightforward that we could just put the cure into the milk supply, like vitamin D. I mean, psychopathy at that point would just be a nutritional deficiency. And so if the cure for evil becomes just a matter of dropping something into the milk supply, well then ask yourself, would it be ethical to withhold the cure from somebody as a punishment because they were so evil? So somebody did something truly terrible, they're locked away in prison. Now we completely understand the nature of human evil, but we're going to withhold this cure as a punishment for this person. Well, that wouldn't make any moral sense, because it would be just like withholding a surgery from the man with a tumor if we knew the tumor was the actual cause of his behavior. It just wouldn't make any moral sense at all. And that suggests to me that it's, who knows if we'll ever get a cure for psychopathy, but it suggests to me that the urge for retribution is based on not actually seeing the causality in any kind of detail.
Sam, we ask authors often who are just coming out with new books, and one of the people that we invited this year was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I'm not sure if you've read his book, but he agrees with you completely, because in the first paragraph he said it's not a tumor. Not the tumor. Okay, bad joke. That went over very well. Trying to lighten it up here a little bit. We have a live question over here. So we're going to have to do like speed round here, because we have 1,000 questions, which I will promise to read some of them. But Michael.
Thank you, Sam, for the interesting and thought-provoking ideas. I was going to ask you what you thought the difference between truth and hypothesis was, because I believe you do confuse them at times. But what instead, listening to your comments, I decided to change my mind and ask a question: where you think love and commitment come from in relational sense?
But you only have 3 minutes to answer that. Very.
They're almost the same answer, actually. But love, there are two ways we could talk about this. We can talk about where these things come from, and that seems to suggest an evolutionary answer, at least in our case. We're talking about the psychology of positive social emotions that knit us together as social apes. It's not surprising that we value these states of mind and their associated behaviors. I mean, that's all. Evolutionary psychology has a lot to say about that. I think that's the how we got here story is much less interesting than the what is possible story. And the what is possible story also has a scientific description. So the question of just how good can human life be? What are the truly normative ways of being in the world, subjectively and socially, so as to maximize your own flourishing and the flourishing of others? And love is clearly one of those, one piece of software you want humming along on the hard drive most of the time. And there are certain instances where it may be non-adaptive or not compatible with survival, say. But for the most part, how we got here in evolutionary terms is less interesting to me, though it's a completely valid area of inquiry, than just what is human consciousness capable of. even beyond that, what is consciousness capable of? And are we in danger of designing computers that can suffer more than we can? So I mean, that's a question that has an answer. And depending on the answer, there are ethical implications there. Now, I don't spend any time worrying about conscious computers at the moment, but at least there's a truth there whether or not we can find the answer. And I think love is one of where it comes from is not nearly as interesting as why it matters, given all that we know, given the range of conscious states we have available. Is there anything better than love as a interpersonal tone? And is there any? Does life get worse when you want other people, as a reflex, where you want other people to be happy, where you want their dreams realized, where you want them to flourish? Are we really in a zero-sum situation? Or are we collaborating creatively to build the best possible world? And granted, there are instances where there is a zero-sum contest, or it seems to be. There's one slice of pie left, and there's 10 of us, and we all want it. Well, then then we need some negotiation or some system that's going to be fair. But now, why does fairness make any sense? Why is fairness good? Well, fairness is good because it, more often than not, redounds to everyone's advantage. Even the 9 people who don't get the pie in that instance know that in a fair system, they are better off more often than not. And there's also a pleasure to be taken in somebody else's pleasure. And there's a pleasure to be taken in being someone who's willing to sacrifice for someone else's pleasure. Some people get more pleasure from saying, "Oh, no, you take the pie. I wanted it, but actually I want you to have it." And there's all kinds of cynical ways of interpreting that, and in an evolutionary sense. But the truth is, love is one of the most rewarding things anyone ever experiences, and we want it. And people who don't experience it or claim not to want it are actually missing something. And that's an objective. That's not just a subjective, culturally dependent thing to say. I think that's an objective thing to say. It's like saying, people who don't understand calculus. There's something they don't understand. They're missing something. There's a way of understanding calculus, and there's a way of failing to understand it. And there is a there, whether you know it or not, or whether any individual knows it or not. And who knows how far that horizon of human experience goes. But I think love is one of the best compasses we've got.
And the election of commitment?
What was that?
And the election of commitment?
What do you mean by commitment?
Such as in a marriage commitment.
Like monogamy? Well, it's just, when you think of, human life is replete with this particular psychological experiment where people sort of rethink the whole logic of commitment and say, well, monogamy doesn't really make evolutionary sense, and, honey, sorry, but I want an open relationship. I just read Darwin. But the truth is, for most people, most of the time, there's a lot of psychological suffering engineered by failures of commitment, and a lot of comfort in commitment. And but I'm open to. You could certainly find me an island of non-committed people who are flourishing just as much as the happiest committed people, and they're completely unpossessive in their sexuality, and they love it, and they have a whole story to tell about how it's the best thing going. I don't doubt that that's possible. So when I view my argument about the moral landscape is that there could be peaks of human well-being that are different. There could be many different peaks, which they're different and they're irreconcilable. Which is to say, if you're on this one, well, you got to be committed, and you're really jealous if you're not over failures of commitment. On this one, you don't even know what jealousy is. But they could be equivalent in all kinds of other ways, and that's intellectually possible to me. I just don't happen to see it in the people I meet.
So speaking of speed rounds, we do have a question about Oprah here. So explain Oprah.
I know nothing about Oprah.
But she was the youngest of 11 children, raped, extremely poor. Why didn't she just end up as a Southern mom of several children living on welfare?
Well, whatever the reason is, there's a reason, obviously. I mean, there's some causal, and she may not know it. She may have a story about what the reason is, which doesn't actually track the facts. She could have false memories about conversations that were incredibly important to her, and it turns out they weren't important because she was already on that path beforehand. Who knows? But I mean, we're not actually necessarily the best judge of why things happened and why we did certain things. We know this from psychology, but I don't know. I mean, she has the genes she has. She's had the life experience she's had. She was able to rise to the challenge, and now she's a force of nature.
Based on your premise, if you were able to deny the existence of a person genetically predisposed to murder even before they were born, would you? How do we tread these murky moral waters?
Oh, well, see, denying the existence of a person, I mean, you sort of have that for free always. I mean, so because there are a functionally infinite number of potential people now. So my decision not to have a third child or a fourth child or a fifth child is to deny the existence of that subsequent person. In fact, with genetic engineering, just scratching my nose is to commit a holocaust of potential people, because all of these cells are potential human beings given the right manipulation. So you're just denying people every time you lift a fork or turn your head. I mean, you're just. So it's not. I think there definitely is some value in potential life. It's not like it's nothing. So we shouldn't be. So there is a cost when you talk about the ethical meaning of certain events, and you say, well, here's the person's life who was cut off, and all the good things that didn't happen as a result. That hypothetical life is meaningful to somebody.
But what if it's like the 4-year-old that you were talking about? So if you look at a 4-year-old and you go, we've kind of studied, your genes, we've studied your experiences so far, and chances are you're going to turn out to be as odious as Saddam Hussein's son. Do you picture a society where we have so much knowledge about the human brain that we start making decisions on people because of what we believe they will do, based on your hypothesis?
Well, I don't see the prospect of our getting there in sort of kind of a Minority Report way of pre-crime. I don't see that being in the cards certainly anytime soon, but. Or even in principle, it may just be may be too complicated to ever predict the behavior of a system as complex as the human brain that far in advance. I mean, it's hard to predict. Ironically, the best way to predict what somebody is going to tend to do is just to ask them. I mean, that's why talking to people actually. It's not that they can't deceive you, or it's not that they can't be self-deceived, but the people who are telling you what they're interested in and what they want to do and what they hope to have happen, and the neo-Nazis who are going to protest and have their placards and their websites and all of their efforts, they are advertising their conscious states ad nauseum, and who knows if any one person really believes what he says he believes. There is a distance between what people profess to believe and what they actually believe, or what would be behaviorally operational. But we know a lot about what people will do based on what they've done and what they say they want to do. And I don't know that a brain scan is going to get much. It's not going to get much better than that predicting across time. It gets better than that in the moment. So, for instance, we know we could all go to a psychology lab tomorrow and get tested on various stimuli and have our innate racism uncovered. And whether or not you think you're racist or not, we know virtually everyone shows some racial bias when put through this paradigm of the implicit association test. And you're just slow. So if we showed you positive words and faces of various races, your race and some other race, you would be slower to associate positive words to the out-group face than to your own group, and quicker to associate negative words. And no matter how liberal you are, no matter how embarrassed you are, no matter how much you want to prove to the experimenter you're not racist, you will fail to demonstrate a lack of racial bias. So that's insight into the nature. So that's something you can know about yourself and be on guard for its insidious effects in your life. And it's a good ethical norm to want to correct for it. I mean, this is something we want to get away from, and we're right to want to get away from it. But science can dig into the details of our minds even now in ways that we might find surprising.
Ian.
Thanks, Leah. I'd like to go back to the question of God for a second. Pascal suggested that the betting man would believe in God, because if you believe in God
Right.
and God doesn't exist, then at least you might have lived a virtuous life. But if you don't believe in God and God does exist, then you're probably damned for eternity.
Right.
So can you tell me why you think that more people believe in God than don't believe?
Well, first let me say I think Pascal's wager it's like many of the exports of philosophy. It's a bit of bad philosophy that is really easy to remember, and then it just gets it has infected all of us. And there's some of the worst exports of philosophy are like that. Yeah, no, I know. I just want to sort of inoculate everyone else against this idea, because beliefs don't work that way. Right. Well, one reason is many people are taken in by ideas like this. So Pascal's wager seems, given to in the presence of anyone who's even remotely sympathetic with the project of faith and the leap of faith. They think Pascal's wager passed every test of reasonableness. So of course, that's a wager you could take. But what Pascal is suggesting is that you could decide to believe something not because you have evidence suggesting its truth, but because of the likely good effects of this belief. Or you're wanting it to be true. So obviously, if you're wanting something to be true is one of the reasons why you believe it's to be true. Well, you're just the poster child for wishful thinking or self-deception. I mean, that is exactly that's why we have the word wishful thinking or self-deception. Or cognitive bias. I mean, all of these things are meant to put us on guard against that very attitude. And we know we have those biases, but to consciously believe something that you have no good reason to believe is true, in fact, many reasons to believe is not true, based on the threat that if you don't believe it, and it is true, you're screwed, that is not something you can do in the full light of consciousness, or so I would imagine. If you're someone who claims to have done that, you sort of you were on the track to believe this anyway, and now this is something this is a game you play in terms of justifying it. Beliefs are not like clothing. You can't. Their comfort and their utility can't be our reason for adopting them, and so I think Pascal just was not being kind of honest on that point, but. Why are so many people religious? Well, it's not that there's no. It has many effects that could be beneficial to groups. It enforces a kind of in-group coherence, and may energize certain groups in competition with other groups to all be organized around the same otherworldly God and behavioral taboos and superstitions. But I think that the deeper issue is that we have this feature of our minds of forming beliefs about that. We have language, we have cognition, we have a desire to understand what's going on in the world, which is not hard to explain. And we've had this for as long as we could. I mean, just imagine what we were like when we knew absolutely nothing, when we really were just apes trying to find food. And at odds with everything in the world that we didn't understand, including strange conspecifics, which is other apes who were not on the same team. And we begin this project trying to figure out where we are and how to make things better. and how to organize ourselves. And religion is in some sense, the first effort to do that. It's like to intuit order in the world and to personalize that order. To say, so when you see a bolt of lightning, to think that that is, you're in relationship to something that is raining down that bolt of lightning. And that there are unseen forces that you could somehow propitiate in order to make life better. I mean, we come from a species, in almost every culture on earth, that practice human sacrifice for the explicit reason of propitiating angry gods for all manner of things, to change the weather, to make sure buildings would stay up. I mean, we used to bury children alive in post holes dug under the foundation of buildings as a way to just to hope that the buildings wouldn't be knocked down by earthquakes or wind. And this is what happens in the absence of engineers. This is how we respond to the vagaries of nature. So this is where we come from. And I mean, it's a miracle. So what's not, to my eye, what's strange is not that we have still so much religiosity around us. What's amazing is that anything works at all. You know, that we have figured anything out. And so it's when you just look at how religious enthusiasm and conviction has winnowed on every specific question where it has really collided with science over the last, I mean, in the West, and not to speak of Christianity specifically. When you look at, before there was a germ theory of disease and before there was anything like real medicine, we had no idea how people got sick. People were just dropping dead all around us. Unless we saw them clubbed over the head, we didn't know why. And so the answers to all of these problems were religious. It was the evil eye, it was demonic possession, it was God striking you down for blaspheming. So when the bubonic plague started raging in Europe, we were literally cutting people's tongues out for blasphemy as a response to the plague, because we had no idea what we were dealing with. But the moment we develop a scientific understanding and response to the mechanisms of disease, all of these questions get answered now in the purview of science. And now the people who are performing exorcisms on their epileptic children, they are a total aberration, at least in the West. I mean, there are certain places where they're not. And that is the thing to notice about that is a unidirectional process. I submit that there is no question on which science was once the authority, but now, after years of progress, that authority has been ceded to the church, right? But there are a functionally infinite number of questions where it has run the other way, and that's just going to keep happening. So
I think it's fascinating just to think about, if we were to project ourselves 200 years into the future, what would we be laughing about that we are doing today in our society? I'm conscious of the time that we've got two more questions, and I'll ask the final one. We've got one at the back.
Hi, Sam. Welcome to the most secular city in Canada.
Oh, thank you.
In North America, maybe. I'm with the Centre for Inquiry. We're Canada's largest free thought skeptical organization.
Yeah.
I think you're familiar with us. I'm an atheist, very proud to say so, like you are. So I have a concern about your free will argument. And it's that 7-second or 1 second gap that opens up between when our subconscious makes a decision and when we act, that there might be room there for the religious to have the soul enter that gap.
Right.
And I wonder, first of all, if you think that that's a legitimate a problem that exists with your argument, or is the soul just like a tumor?
Well, as I said, I don't think the soul helps. I think that if you don't know what your soul is going to do next, you're not in control of your soul. So it's the gap isn't really. I don't even need the gap. You can trim down the gap to nothing. And so let's say the moment you're conscious of deciding is in fact the first moment that your brain or your soul kicked off this decision. You still don't know why it was the way it was. So if I say to you, you're completely free right now. I'm gonna ask you to think of something, a category of thing. You can pick anyone you want. You're completely free. Think of a city somewhere on Earth other than Vancouver. Just take as long as you want. You can have as many candidates. You can go back and forth. Whatever you decide on, Right now, the first thing to notice is that there's all these cities whose names you know, and let's say you know, so Cairo is a city, and you just didn't happen to think of Cairo. Let's say you were trying to decide between Calgary and New York and Paris, and for whatever reason you picked Paris, but Cairo you never entertain. You absolutely know that Cairo is a city. So the question is, for whatever reason, Cairo was not in the cards, whether it was a state of your brain or a state of your soul. So my question is, were you free to pick that which did not occur to you to pick? And I think the obvious answer is no. You were just not free. Cairo was not happening. And for a reason you can't explain, which is completely set up by the prior state of the universe, soul included, whatever. And obviously I don't think there's a good reason to import a soul into the clockwork, but the soul doesn't help this particular problem. It's still fundamentally mysterious.
Bill, we're going to jump to you.
Yeah, just one. So for me, I think to get this free will thing, I got to come back to a concrete example. And lawyers, no animal, but go back to Penn State and Jerry Sandusky.
Uh-huh.
So if I believe in free will, which presumably a lot of people who were on that jury and the judge did, they did something. So I accept your analysis and your premise, and I don't want to be just dancing on the head of a pin. What do I do different? What does that change to what I'm going to do? And how I'm going to deal with that? If what I do, presumably you're telling me it's not determinism, so what I do with him is going to affect others, because it's part of their experience.
Well, that's still
But a whole bunch,
determinism.
so what do I do?
Yeah.
Why does this at all matter to me in terms of dealing with that?
Well,
what would I do different?
I think it depends what you mean by you. I mean, there's you and then there's society. So what society should do is we shouldn't think in terms of retribution. We should think purely in terms of what is going to prevent suffering and what's going to alleviate suffering. We should think of restitution. We should think of deterrence. We should think of all the important things that actually matter in terms of mitigating human suffering, the suffering of kids in this case and their parents. So Sandusky is, I view Sandusky and anyone like him just very much like a grizzly bear, in the sense that he didn't make himself, and if I were him, I would be him. I mean, I'm actually not responsible for the fact that I'm not him. By some accident of good fortune, I don't have the problem that Sandusky has. And the problem includes his intentional behavior, his conscious behavior, his unconscious behavior, his desires, his resistance against his desires, his failed resistance. The whole complex, whatever it was like to be Sandusky, by sheer good fortune, I don't have to be that guy, right? And I'm very grateful for that. And so the question is, do I hate him, or do I fear him and want to restrain him? And it's certainly the latter. Now, I'm as susceptible as anyone to hating somebody like that. I mean, I have a 4-year-old daughter, so you get me started thinking about the problem of sexual predation on kids. I can get worked up, but when I'm thinking clearly about the situation, I know that no pedophile is truly responsible in a deep sense for who he is, and the remedy for whatever the remedy is for the problem of pedophilia comes at the. Perhaps there will at one point be a cure for pedophilia. So we can see that whatever conformity of your brain is at age 10, you're at risk to be a pedophile, and we know this as clearly as we know that you're at risk for heart disease or early onset Alzheimer's, or whatever you could make it as probabilistic or as ironclad as you want. But insofar as it became ironclad, we would look at it as an affliction, and we would offer a remedy if we had it. Now, if we don't have a remedy, we would lock people up to protect everybody else, and that's what we should do. So, but the difference is, retribution makes no sense, and all of the interpersonal hatred of people who are bad actors makes no sense. Compassion makes sense. Compassion is compatible with locking someone up for the rest of his life if there's no cure if there's no way to stop him from harming others. You can still feel compassion for that person. Now that may be certainly asking a lot if you happen to be the parent of one of those kids or one of the kids, but I don't think it's asking a lot of a sort of an institutional doctrine of creating a society that just views. Again, the retribution doesn't. If we're just looking at grizzly bears and sharks and all of the other risks in the world that are kind of agent-driven, retribution doesn't make sense in that. Yet, but protection makes sense. Keeping the bears out of our living rooms makes sense. And so there's not necessarily a difference in terms of the steps we would take to protect ourselves, but there's a different. In certain cases, there are. There's certain people who are in prison for things that they shouldn't be in prison for, and it's based on the whole notion of a victimless crime to me makes absolutely no sense. Either there's some cost to so the war on drugs, for instance, is something that just has, in my view, created an immense amount of suffering, and the problem of addiction, the problem of all of the pathologies around addiction, should be treated as a problem of education and treatment, not as a crime problem, but is kind of a righteous, retributive overlay that has justified this war on drugs for decades, and you have people wanting the state to kick in the door and stop people from doing things which in many cases are harming no one, not even themselves. So obviously in other cases there are harms that we should worry about, but again I see it as a problem of education and treatment, and once you unlock from the whole retributive schema, some of these questions kind of answer themselves.
We're going to do just one final question, and then I have a fantastic stack of questions. We do have an after-dinner salon on your way out with cheese and champagne, and so I hope those of you whose questions I didn't get to will take a few moments with Sam. But our last conversation and question here is going to be Peter Brown.
Sam, great evening, great talk. I think perhaps your argument on free will is too simple to understand in a way.
Yeah.
But and I do I would say something and ask a question. Your remarks about Hitchens strike home with me, and Leah actually was involved in their former life where we brought him to Vancouver. And I really admire both he and Stephen Jobs, a couple of icons as they were in their final hours, both talking about how the experience of death focused them on what was really important. And what I admired is that neither of them succumbed to Pascal's argument.
Right.
Neither made a deal with God on the way out. And I thought that Hitchens particularly, he said it was a hard thing to practice, and secondly, that he was afraid that he might get well because it would prove that all the people that prayed for him would be right. But going back to your argument about what is God's and what is science.
But what is what and what is science?
What is God's in life and what is science? Right. Clearly, what is science is growing and what's God is shrinking, and yet religions aren't shrinking.
Well, that's not entirely true. They're shrinking certainly in the developed world, apart from the outlier of the United States. The trends of secularization are just linear in Western Europe. The only change is that Muslim immigration to these societies, obviously the people who are coming in are very religious. So
we have all this evidence that, the hardship they create and the tragedy they create, and the fact that invention is insolence to them. And then you look at it. It seems to me, yes, I see it growing, but their ability to make mischief is, with all the science we have, it seems to me as great as ever. And somehow there's this phenomenal need in man for 2,000 years. We've been drawing gods in caves, right? It doesn't seem to. And maybe your argument of, I hope it's a fact that we don't have free will that allows it to grow. Hopefully, if we did have a free will, we would see it a little differently.
Well, I think we at the core of religion, so all of the false consolations of religion that are, it's understandable why people want them. So you have your child dies. Religion is the only story that makes that a non-problem. Religion is the only story you can tell yourself or be told by others, which, if believed, just cancels the reason for grieving, if you could really believe it. Because now your child is in heaven, which is a lot better than Vancouver, and you will get there after death. Unless you live in Toronto. Right. Yes, so there's that. But there's also just the fact that there's a range of human experience that is incredibly positive and interesting, self-transcending experiences of a sort that lie at the core of most religions. Whoever Jesus was, in fact, historically, the literature that testifies to his view of the world, where you hear propositions like loving your neighbor as yourself, that's bearing witness to a kind of consciousness that many people have experienced that should be incredibly interesting and worth encouraging. And when you've had that one problem, and there's a problem I'm trying to address in my next book, the problem is if you wake up tomorrow morning loving your neighbor, all neighbors, all of humanity, all sentient beings as yourself, if you have this sort of mind-blowing experience of compassion and unconditional love that completely transforms your mind and life and your expectation of what it is to be a human being and how good life can be, and you are such a dazzling person that when you come out of your house, everyone recognizes that something amazing has happened to you and they just want to hang out with you because you've got such good vibes. Okay, that is something that happens, right? And the only game in town that gives us even the slightest credence to that phenomenon is religion. So when that happens to you, the only people who are going to take you seriously are either mainstream religions or New Age cults that have their own spin on it. So, but it is a part of the phenomenology of at the positive end of human experience. Now it has sort of its pathological echoes elsewhere on the spectrum of human experience. You have the crazy messiahs, the people who are obviously belong in mental hospitals, but they also think they're Jesus. There are other ways of experiencing erosion of a conventional self. But there's an incredibly positive experience that people can have, many of them, that only religion has talked about, and very few scientists have any awareness of or interest in. And we have to overcome that, because when people feel these things, or meet people who credibly feel these things, they say, well, this is clearly the most important thing in life. This is who I want to be. This is who I want to be with. And the only language that seems to capture it is religion. And that I just think is that more conversation about what's really going on in the brain and in the world is just one thing that, perhaps I'll close on this, one thing that should make it patently obvious that can't prove that any one religion is true is that people from every religion and none have that experience. So when a Christian has that experience, he says, see, it's just the grace of God. I know Jesus is the Son of God. I know Christianity is true. And when a Muslim feels a little bliss like that, he knows that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And Hindus and Buddhists and everyone does the same thing, and yet all of their doctrines are mutually incompatible and mutually canceling. And atheists have the same experience, or can. So we know that there's some deeper story that accounts for this experience. And we know that in principle it must be universalizable and insensitive to the accidents of people's birth and culture. And it's just a deeper truth about the nature of the human mind. And so we should want to understand it and talk about it in terms of 21st century rationality.
Sam, I think that's just a terrific note to end on. I just think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. It's certainly unique in terms of the speakers that we've had so far. I don't think we've ever gotten so philosophical, but I think it's one of these conversations that has planted the seeds of so many ideas that I know that we will carry forward. So thank you very much.
Well,
for
thank
a
you for the
terrific
invitation.
presentation.
Thank you.